So let's get started straight away then. So hi everyone, welcome to our second webinar in our trust series. Today's webinar is going to be focused on trust and team behaviours, and in particular values. So a little bit of housekeeping to begin with as usual. If you can add your comments and questions into either the chat or the Q&A, I'll keep an eye on them throughout the webinar and we'll get as many questions as possible answered in the time that we have. I'm helpfully not able to move on my slides, which is a good start today. So first of all, a quick introduction to MyPeople for those of you who don't know us. We're experts in measuring the psychological factors that affect team performance. Have you ever been impacted by a decision that was made without all the facts and that affected the whole team? Did it lead to mistrust in the decision, the process, or even worse, the people? We take the guesswork out of teams and enable confidence and fairness in people decision making that allows you to unlock the value of trust in your business. So a quick intro to today's speakers. My name's Wendy Kilgannon. I'm the UK sales manager here at MyPeople, and I'm joined today by psychologist and MyPeople CEO Christian Hughes and director of Saracens Way and former Saracens rugby player Will Fraser. Hi guys.
Hello. Hello. Hello everyone.
So Christian and Will are going to take you through the bulk of the content today, and I will be facilitating. So do please drop your questions into the chat or the Q&A and I'll get the guys to answer them.
So, I think that's me kicking things off. Last session, we talked about trust and specifically team relationships. And this session, we're going to be talking about another contributor to team trust, and that is team behaviours. So to recap briefly on our last session, in most businesses today, there are performance targets in place and some form of engagement surveying to see how people are doing. Managing these performance targets and engagement surveying suffer from the same problem. The data they provide are outputs. So if you think of any target you have in your organization, whether it's a sales target or a customer target, project deliverables, shareholder targets, if you're focusing solely on these targets, that sets the direction, but not the journey. So these are the where, not the why or the how of your business. These targets and how you're tracking against them is like the scoreboard in a game. You need to have an eye on the scoreboard or you don't know what you're doing, but focusing entirely on the scoreboard means you're not focused on the game. So performance management then is a scoreboard item, an output, and engagement is an output. They measure a moment in time in very narrow terms. So you hit a goal or you didn't hit a goal, you completed a task or you didn't complete the task, you are engaged or you are not engaged, you feel happy or sad. They're all retrospective, they're looking backwards, and they are outputs. They are caused by something else. And what we need to be doing to complete the circle really is to measure inputs. So what are inputs? Inputs are the things we contribute or do in our teams that enable performance or happiness to flourish. So if we measure skills, capability, training and development, we're capturing the toolkit that helps produce the output. What we really want to know though is the emotional and psychological inputs. These are the factors that drive performance and sustain performance. So the toolkit can change and the people can change, but we want an environment that encourages the right behaviours to make sure teams are more likely to be effective. Now, based on 20 years of experience in elite sport, we've been researching and understanding what those emotional and psychological inputs are and how to measure them. And this has led us to know, if you will, the three most impactful areas to measure are team relationships. So the quality and depth of relationships is behind the effort we invest and how supported we feel. Team alignment, which is around the alignment of our focus, the sense of shared purpose is critical to any team achievement. Team behaviours. So this is having a set of values and behaviours, and they are your way of operating. These affect how you communicate, what is important, how you go about your job. They are stronger than a set of rules. Done well, they are a set of commitments that an individual makes to the team. And together, these give you team trust. Trust in your teammates, your leaders, your organization, and ultimately in yourself. So if you put low trust in a team, everyone starts fighting for themselves. The focus becomes protection, and creating and maintaining high trust. If you can create and maintain high trust, you'll find that collaboration and growth becomes the norm. So trust is multifaceted. And in our last session, we focused on team relationships and how to measure them. And in this session, we're focusing on team values and behaviours and how to measure those.
So there's another Simon Sinek quote for you all this week. As I said last week, he's done, or 3 weeks ago, whenever the last webinar was, he's done a lot of research into factors that affect performance in teams, and he talks a lot about trust and why it's so important in the workplace. In Start With Why, his book, it's also relevant to the conversations that we're having today. The why of your organisation is demonstrated through an organisation's values and behaviours. And what we're going to look at is why it's so important that the values and behaviours of an organisation are aligned with the individual's values and behaviours.
So here you've obviously got 4 segments on the slide, all are challenges to team trust. So you've obviously got social relations, task relations, emotional disconnection, and perceived unity. But when I look at these 4, obviously all challenges to trust, for me, each one of them doesn't have any input without starting with the social relations, so shared values and actions. So when you look at task relations, potential silos, I think that in itself comes about from a lack of shared values and a lack of people buying into the same philosophy. But look at emotional disconnection, that comes back to the same reason. People become emotionally disconnected because they don't feel part of the group, they don't feel part of something bigger, which again comes back to having that shared value system. And the perceived unity, again, pretty self-explanatory. Without the emotional connection, you're not going to be united as an organisation. So for me, although they are all challenges to trust, I think task relations, emotional connection, perceived unity could be mitigated to a pretty large degree by starting with the social relations, by getting those values shared up front, everyone bought in, everyone in agreement. And once you have that agreement and that connectivity, actually the actions of the behaviour become the very natural byproduct of it. If I think back to when I was playing at Saracens, and for those of you on the call that are kept up to date with Saracens will know that our values have come under fire pretty heavily the last 6 months or so. But before January of 2020, you know, the absolute core to our success as a club were our values, just purely because they bound everyone together. They governed everything we did, what we did on the pitch, our game plans, how we behaved with each other off the pitch, every bit of kind of content and press, everything was guided by those 4 words. So I think in having those, what it gives you is the ability to create a plan. It gives you that platform to actually create longevity and create sustainable success. Move on to the next slide, please, Wendy. So obviously, when your performance is under threat, when teams, a lot of people, organisations, particularly I see now, when stuff starts to go wrong, the finger normally always goes to the really obvious thing, kind of the most recent thing that's gone wrong, really superficial reasons. And then rather than kind of fix the fundamental problem, people will almost put the plaster over the wound and try and fix what the obvious immediate threat is. But when you actually track back, it's like these black swan events where something goes wrong and people think it's the previous action that's caused the problem. But actually, when you dig beneath the surface, you find that there's probably been multiple events over the course of a period of time that have continually gone wrong, that have led to kind of this big moment happening. And more often than not, it comes down to a lack of trust. Somewhere along the line, it's someone either knowing there's something wrong, but not actually feeling confident and trusted to voice the opinion. It might be a lack of feedback. It might be whatever it is. More often than not, it comes back to a lack of trust. And obviously, if you have the lack of trust, you're going to be underperforming. Next slide, please, Wendy. And then obviously that feeds very nicely into the stuff that Christian's spoken about already and MyPeople. So Christian spoke at the start around, you know, a lot of people, a lot of organisations, sport in particular, heavily measure outputs. You know, that's almost the first port of call. When you're going to measure something, you measure the output. But for me, measuring the output is almost redundant if you don't know what the input is to actually create that output. And once you know what the input is, then really everything should go into measuring that input. So if we figure out that actually sustainable success is built on shared values, is built on connection, is built on trust and relationships, then those are the things we should be measuring. And if we're measuring those and we're keeping track of those, then actually the outcome more often than not will look after itself. And it becomes a much more genuine, authentic way of actually running an organization. If the focus is always on the output, is always on the result, then actually what happens is you miss all these tiny little moments that could lead to a better outcome. What happens is the focus becomes about the number rather than the people. If you focus on the input and you're focusing on the relationships, the values and the trust, your focus is on the people. Your focus is on the here and now. You can solve problems on the hop. You care about the people, which means that very naturally you're going to get a higher level of performance off the back of it. Cool.
I think that's me. So we've talked about some of the ever-present threats to trust in teams, and Will was just running through those 4 quadrants, those 4 boxes. And some of those threats are amplified by the current working practices and changes that have occurred from COVID. I'm not going to mention the word unprecedented. It seems impossible to go through any news feed nowadays without that word, but I'll try and stick clear of it today. But what I do want to do is just take a moment to recap on what low trust looks and feels like in a team, because the chances are you've either experienced some of these symptoms yourself or you've seen it in close quarters in other teams. So if you don't feel any trust for your teammates, you're likely to be more individual in your approach. Because why would you engage with your teammates if you don't trust them? You're more likely to feel any feedback or comment from teammates as accusatory, it's critical, or they want something from you. And your lack of trust for your teammates is going to make you suspicious of their motives and actions. You're more likely to be cautious and reserved in giving your opinion because you feel you'll be criticised, not listened to, or worse, maybe even ridiculed. And all of this leads you to share less of yourself, be less in the team, and ultimately lead you to be more protective in your efforts and more protective in your outlook. And worse, you'll perpetuate the same characteristics that you see. So you start to become critical of others. You start to be skeptical about their efforts. You're not willing to listen to others in your team because you don't believe in what they say. So you become protective rather than growing. So now let's focus on what that looks like from a team perspective. So this is a team that's not collaborating. This is a team that is defensive, cynical, cautious. They're not focused on growth, but focused on protecting themselves. And does that sound like a team that's going to perform well? Now, for the most part, I'm calling out extreme behaviours to demonstrate how a lack of trust works. But when you throw in the challenges to trust we've identified already and how the current situation amplifies those challenges, we can see that a low trust team before COVID is going to be a high risk team for low performance, or a high risk team for performance drop off. Just pop to the next slide, please, Wendy. Great. So what does a high trust team look like? Hopefully, everyone on this call will know what that feels like too. You like most of your teammates. You care about them and know about their lives, and they know about yours. You share a similar outlook on events. You agree on what is important. You're happy to share your opinion and views, because even if they're not right, or if they're not everyone is in agreement with your view, you feel you'll be listened to. You accept challenges and feedback because you trust your teammates to be honest with you, and you trust that they're trying to help you. And you listen to your teammates, even if you disagree with them, and you'd go the extra mile and effort for them because you actually care and believe in your team. So you and the team are in a virtuous cycle of growth. But teams with high trust are also under threat. And I think of trust as a bit like cleaning the house or the garden. If you don't keep working on it, the house and garden gets messy. So you need to be measuring trust to make sure you get the early warning signs of any drop-off. Pop us on to the next one. Great. So the aim then is not just to measure trust, but to track it over time, to compare across teams, see how it goes up in response to training and development, see how trust and performance correlate. And I want to share a quick story from our GB cycling days. And going back right to the very beginning of GB cycling, so before marginal gains and the Olympic success of 2012 in London and 2016 in Rio, at the beginning of the measurement and analytics journey at GB cycling. So picking up on Will's point around outputs and performance in sport. So performance in those very early days of GB cycling were thought of in physical terms. So there were two main variables in performance measurement in those early days of cycling: the bike, so things like aerodynamics and the weight of the bike and the stickiness of the tyres. And the second variable, and if you were to ask any of the analysts, by far the most irritating thing to measure was the human. I think if we could have automated bikes in GB cycling, the analysts would be a lot happier. So performance from a human perspective was, in those early days, fundamentally about power. The power an athlete could generate and sustain at the pedal of the bike. And with this view of performance, you can imagine the focus of effort in those early days was on very physical things. So muscle density for more effort and stamina for more endurance. And this sort of starting point led to a desire to understand what other inputs, direct and indirect, were leading to the power numbers and ultimately to performance. So this quest to measure inputs led to the ideas and approaches that later on became marginal gains. Over time, those inputs became more understood and they became more abstracted and more indirect, perhaps, in the way we would think of them in business terms. So things like nutrition. Now, we could focus on nutrition and we knew we could increase stamina by getting people eating diet plans and plans that worked specifically for individuals' biological makeups. There was personalized coaching, so that individuals got a specific relationship going with a coach, because we started to understand that relationships were important to performance and trust. Then to improving athletes' understanding of a race, so education and training, to thinking clearly under pressure, so mental strength, to psychological factors, all the way through, abstracted all the way through from those really early physical measurements to behaviours, focus, relationships and trust. So what started as a very direct measurement of inputs became a much broader understanding of what creates performance. And time again, when we ran the numbers, we would find that the consistent influencer of an athlete's long-term physical input was emotional and psychological factors. So it was the trust in the team and trust and therefore confidence in what they were doing. So if you could pop us onto the next slide.
Move on, Christian, there's just a question about the previous slide, which is the drop off of trust in the high trust teams was actually quite severe. Is that a scale thing on the chart? But do you have any insight as to why the current situation has had such an impact on team trust?
In general terms, the teams that we've worked with and seen results for that had any issues before, they've been amplified by COVID. And I think things like working from home create silos by virtue of the nature of focusing in on your work and perhaps not having as many opportunities to communicate. So that can amplify in low trust teams, that can amplify problems. And in high trust teams, the inability to connect in the same way as before suddenly removes a lot of the glue that was already present and was perhaps helping that team to perform. So yeah, identifying it becomes the one of the most important factors.
Thank you.
So just to summarize, we overemphasize or rely on output measurements like targets and engagement surveying, but all forms of targets, we overemphasize them and we over-rely on them. And this means we're often cloudy or at worst blind to the inputs that create the conditions for performance. But the good news is visibility and insight into teams is possible. So the aim of this series of webinars is to show you how to measure trust in teams by measuring three critical areas of teams: relationships, behaviours and alignment. So in this particular webinar, we're focusing on team values and team behaviours. So we're now going to go on to specifically how to measure them. And in the next one, we'll be looking at goal alignment.
So I think it's just important to note that often when we talk about values and behaviours, we use them slightly interchangeably. Values are the beliefs that we hold and behaviours are the actions that demonstrate and support those beliefs. teams that share values and operate with the same behaviours have consistent platform for performance. And we all sort of know when that's happening because we can feel it. But the big question really is, how do you measure it, and how can you identify when it's happening?
I think this is you and I, Will.
Yeah, so I think, so to just begin with, when you look at the values framework, I think the really interesting thing with values is, and I was actually having a conversation with someone else on this call yesterday about a similar topic, is values are very easy to box tick. It's a very easy thing to say you've got shared values and they're on your wall in the office, or they're on all your marketing collateral. But for them to genuinely be agreed by the whole organisation, or to be shared, is a whole different case entirely. So I've worked with a lot of groups where, when we sat down initially to kind of go on this journey and start by creating a shared set of values, for the majority of people, the initial reason to do it is for external purposes. It's so they can show potential clients who they are, they can tell potential customers how they behave. And to be completely honest and frank, in my humble opinion, I think that's a complete wrong way round to do it. Your values as an organisation are for you as the organisation. It's for your people. It's how you want to interact with each other. It's how you want to behave. It's how you want to show who you are. And if they're genuine and live, then actually you don't need to tell a potential customer what your values are, because they naturally come across in your interaction with them, how you behave, how you talk to them. So a lot of people assume that just because they have organisational values, that everyone's bought into them, that everyone agrees to them just because they're on a wall. 9 times out of 10, maybe even 9.5 times out of 10, that is not the case. Because people in an organisation that may be lower down in the hierarchy immediately go back and say, well, I had no input into those values. I had no say into why we have those values. I don't understand why we have them in the first place. So before we even start measuring anything, there has to be a conversation piece, an education piece on what the values are. What do they mean? How do they come about? How do we interpret them and use them in our day-to-day lives? Not only at work, but actually away from work as people as well. And what that does very naturally is already start to build the trust within the group, because you're valuing people's opinions. You're actually spending time to have these conversations. So I think before we start measuring anything, we actually need to generally have those shared values in place and give people the opportunity to discuss why these, to even disagree. But in that process, what you're doing is opening the conversation to then create more trust, and then you have something worth measuring.
I think that's really true. And I think what's also interesting is the number of meetings that I've been in, even where you talk to people in a HR team or a people team, who are often the people that create those values, but because they're not involved, they haven't been involved in the process, you ask them if their company has values and they say, yes, we've got 5 values, and you ask them what they are and they can't tell you, or they have to turn around and find them because they're written on the wall or they've got them in a document somewhere. And it's because they either haven't been part of the process to create the values, or they don't really understand them or believe in them.
I think every single sporting team that I've been involved in or had sight of has a black book of behaviours or values. I could see Will smiling because it's probably got so banged on. He's probably banged over the head in every single team he's been involved in with this. But I can remember some of the players that we've worked with who played under Clive Woodward were given a black book of behaviours and the behaviours framework that they had all signed up to. And each of the players have been asked to write down initially in an anonymised fashion what they felt were the 3 or 4 most important behaviours that they would sort of live and die by, if you like, that were fundamental to the team being a unit. So every team that I've seen be successful has got this behavioural framework agreed with every single person in the organisation, and then it's about demonstrating those values and doing it every day. Stuart Lancaster, the England coach, the rugby coach, up until 2015, had built it into his selection process. So the more you showed the values both whilst you were playing for England and also at club level, that was given a score that would contribute to your selection for the England team. He took that to some extreme, and it caused him some problem. By the 2015 World Cup, he excluded some of the best players, but that's a whole nother seminar. So once you've got your values, you want to measure how they are being applied, and that starts with a self-assessment. Now, mostly, or one of the most important aspects of that is having and encouraging people to be honest about that self-assessment. We're going to come on to a specific question in a second to give you an idea of this, but the questions that you ask of your people, they must be time-based, so they can be qualified, and they must be quantifiable, so you're measuring the quantity or quality of the behaviour. So that's at a self-assessment level. Once you can then add into that a peer review level, and then you can start to compare self versus peer at an organizational level, and there's quite a few different insights you can get from that alone, even at an aggregated score level. So we work with one organization where I think the bulk of the organization, it was about 600 or 700 people, came back with incredibly high self-assessment scores, sort of in the 90+ percentile. So everybody saying, I absolutely demonstrate the behaviours every single day of my life, and then rated their peers in the 50-60%. So essentially saying it's everybody else, it's not me. That in itself was a huge insight around the sort of protective nature of what was going on in that organisation, and probably the low trust that was existing in that organisation. So you can get huge insight from self-assessment and peer review at team and organizational level, and then ultimately you want to be comparing that to performance, so you can start to build profiles of your organization to see, if we demonstrate the values, does our performance go up? So I'm just going to take you through an example question. So inherent in the self-assessment approach is a sort of survey methodology. So this doesn't need to be complicated. It's a questionnaire format, but there's a number of sort of nuances to this just to flag. Firstly, if you take that first sentence, in the last 6 weeks, so what are we doing there? Well, we're time bounding it. So we're now saying there's a specific period that we're measuring for. Second, we say on multiple occasions. So we're now using quantity as the measurement of this behaviour. We're saying how often is it being demonstrated. So that helps us qualify and quantify the behaviour, rather than just having it as an abstract concept. In this occasion, my initiative, or using my initiative, is the behaviour. So that's the value or behaviour. And the output that we want to then connect that to is in a way that has benefited either my team, a customer, or the wider organisation. Now that's an important element of this. If you think about a behaviour, that you want to know whether it's having an impact. If I'm demonstrating a behaviour that is valued but has no impact on the organisation, then you've got to question why the value exists. What we're looking for here is to get the individual thinking about how they're deploying their behaviour, how often they're doing it, in a time period, and who is it benefiting. So if you start measuring team behaviours along with team relationships, which we covered in the first session, it's going to provide you with the insights you need to take action early. So the things that this might impact are your training approaches, communication, identifying silos, back to the question earlier on high trust teams, building and seeing how shared the purpose is, how common the vision is across the organisation, and it's then giving you an opportunity to strengthen team bonds and working on team trust opportunities, and that leads to thriving teams.
So I suspect there's a number of amongst you who are feeling a bit worried about how you measure this. Don't worry, we can help you. So we're offering companies a free team relationship survey and team behaviour survey to get them started, and it will help give you a baseline to understand where you are now with your trust score. As part of the survey, we'll calculate the trust score, and you'll be able to track it over time, and you'll also be able to compare your teams and organisations with others, because we'll use our benchmarking to help you. And we'll also highlight areas where there's misalignments and action is needed. So could be around training and performance management, development plans, or communication. The impact of these misalignments and not understanding the T-score is potentially increases in staff turnover, reduced productivity, reduced efficiency, goals and targets being missed, and even an impact on profit and loss. But understanding where you are now with your trust score and having the ability to track any changes on the trust score, you can show a direct result of any interventions that you make. All of this together will help you build a thriving team. So how does it work? Well, we'll send your team the MyPeople Team Behaviours survey link via email, and we'll collect their responses. We'll then analyse those responses and provide you with a report that is packed with actionable insights, including that trust score, as well as some industry benchmarks. And then you can start making any necessary changes and begin to monitor the impact of your trust score, as well as the impact of it on performance, whether that's goal achievement or financial performance. If you'd like to learn more or get started on understanding the trust score in your organisation, then you can contact us on wendy@mypeoplegroup.com.
That is actually your email address, isn't it, Wendy, rather than a chatbot? We don't have a Wendy chatbot.
No, the Wendy chatbot is actually my email address.
So you don't need to stop there. You continue supercharging your teams. And I don't know whether we've got the date of the next webinar. There you go. Okay, that's like we thought about it. So we're going to look at team goal and focus alignment, which are often one of the same things, and that's on the 2nd of July at 2 p.m. and that completes the wondrous Venn diagram that gives us our trust score. So that is the next session.
So guys, if you can put your questions in the chat box or the Q&A, that would be great, and I can put them to Christian or Will. Or indeed myself, if it's a question for me. So the first question is in, which is, honesty was a key element in the list of what's required to measure this. It seems like quite a tricky one. What do you have in place that ensures you're getting an honest answer as possible? Is it even possible to do this?
It's definitely one for Will.
Well, I think, to be honest, I did have an answer when I saw it come up. So I think what's really interesting, and we've had it with a client that we've done this with together, Christian, where what you find is that initially when you send stuff out, naturally people will always overscore themselves because there's already a natural lack of trust there. So it's, again, as Christian said at the start, it's this need to kind of protect and a fear of, is this anonymous, or actually is my boss going to see it, therefore I'm going to score them higher than what I actually think. And so what usually tends to happen is the first set of results we get, on the surface it looks like they're a very cohesive group and they all get on with each other and they all share the same values. Then through various interventions, when you kind of break it down and you get to the nuts and bolts of it, what you see is a stark contrast between what the initial data says and then what they say in kind of various sessions. And then by the next set of results, what you then get is actually a worse score but much more honest answers. And then if you keep going away, and this is why tracking it is so important over a period of time, because the more you track it along with interventions, then actually you get more honest answers as you go. So it's only over a period of time do you actually get a genuine reflection of the group of people that you're measuring. And what a lot of people will do, and this is why it's a very counterintuitive thing in many ways, because what a lot of people do is they'll get an initial survey, they get a really good initial score, and they go, oh, okay, brilliant, we're fine, we'll leave it there. But actually, it's so key to do it over that period of time, as Christian says, because only then do you get a genuine, true reflection of the group and what they actually think. And then it's using that data. So it's not just doing it and then doing nothing with it. It's using it to have interventions, to actually start conversations, to promote people to step forward and disagree with what might be happening, whatever it is. So I think you can get honest answers, but it definitely does not happen straight away. I think there's an element of time that gets put into it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I might just add to that, if you don't mind, just to support and amplify that view. What we tend to see is that the first time people interact with MyPeople, and this goes all the way back to our early sports beginnings, is the mindset is one of, I'm going to try and pass this, that it's a test, that I have to perform well on this, that I have to get good numbers. And as Will says, it is counterintuitive, but to get that development happening, you need honesty, and it takes a bit of time for that to start to bed into the numbers and for people to appreciate this isn't about passing or failing. This is about looking for where growth can happen. And you can find that it's sort of 2 or 3 sort of measurements in that you start to get your real baseline, and we start to account for that now in the platform. But then it does tend to happen and become more consistent.
Cool. Do you have questionnaires to monitor the mental health of your remote or not so remote teams?
Yes. In fact, for those who missed the first session, the team cohesion survey that we have, that is developed to measure team relationships has a whole section devoted to mental health, specifically for remote teams at the moment.
Good question here from Lee. Totally agree that the majority of businesses focus on outputs rather than inputs. Do you have any tips on how to help get senior people focus on inputs?
Well, I might do some hand over here to Will, but just to add my 2 pence to the conversation, I think that the problem with outputs in general for business leaders is you get into a cycle of measuring outputs and targets and sitting in front of spreadsheets when you're sitting at board level, and you forget that the things on the spreadsheet, the line items, are not the people who are actually executing and getting those numbers. So some of the focus is getting back onto an analytical approach to measuring input, so understanding what are the factors. If I go back to the GB cycling story, you can start with very direct inputs to your outputs. It doesn't need to be abstracted all the way to the nth degree. It can start with, what things do I need to do in order to hit that number? But as you start to abstract it, you get greater understanding of what factors enable you to hit those numbers that then enable you to hit the output number. So it is a bit of a process and a journey. The more inputs that you understand and have tested, the more control you have over your outputs. And so there does come a point, and it comes back to a common phrase that we had in GB rowing about control the controllables, and what makes the boat focus on what makes the boat go faster. All of this is about what are the things I can actually control that I know contribute to us going faster, or in the case of business, achieving our sales number or business targets. So there is an exercise in there doing some analysis on what are the things that actually influence performance in my business, and then asking yourself, can I control those things? And that's a great, I've gone through that session with performance type sessions in sport, but also in business. And it's a really insightful session, and the sense of empowerment that can come from that is quite cool. You got anything to add on that one, Will?
Yeah, I think going kind of digging a bit deeper, I think it's asking yourself, what is your approach to your organisation? Is it a long-term approach, or is it a short-term approach? So I think when you focus on outputs, it's a very short-term way of thinking, because you're always thinking about the next quarter's number or the annual number, whatever it might be. And because of that, you're always fallible, because you're focusing on something that's a few weeks away. You're not focusing on everything before that. So I remember when I was playing, we always spoke about, what can I do today that makes tomorrow slightly easier? What can I do tomorrow that makes the day after slightly easier? And it's all those little things where actually then you get to a point where if there's a monthly sales number, if you're focused on what can I do today to get me closer to that number tomorrow, then you're actually going to hit that number without ever really focusing on that number. And I think the biggest difference between sport and business is that business always has some form of target or number associated to it. But I think once you know what that number is, it's then asking yourself, where is the focus? Is my focus always on that end number, or is it on what can I do today? And I think going even deeper, when we're focusing on people and things like that, it's so in sport, the equivalent of the number is winning. And if you're a fairly successful organisation that wins quite a lot, then when is winning ever enough? When is that ever really going to fulfill you as a person? I think with all this stuff, we talk about trust and connection, that's when actually that becomes the fulfillment part of it. And then the winning becomes almost a natural byproduct of it. So I think in terms of getting senior people to buy into it, I think the very simple question to ask them is, are we trying to create a long-term sustainable plan to have continuous success? Or are we actually going for a short-term, let's sort this out now, then we'll focus on the next bit? And I think understanding the mindset, and listen, neither one's right or wrong, and this is all just my own humble opinion, but I think that's a really interesting conversation to have with senior people in the business.
What I would say, just as a final addendum on that particular question, is every single sports team that I've worked with, or business team that I've worked with, always has a focus on the inputs. Back to your point about what can I do today that helps me achieve tomorrow, they always have a strong grasp, or have learned how to have a strong grasp on the things that influence performance, and they're always striving to improve them and always trying to look for other things that influence performance. I can think of one story I think is now in the media about the Tour de France, when I can remember it from a business case perspective, when they were looking to transport the mattresses of athletes around France, rather than have athletes sleeping on different mattresses in different hotels each day, week, month. And the cost of that was something astronomical, like 350, 400 grand, because they were big mattresses on a lot of coaches up and down France. And that all stemmed back. The reason that got signed off was it all stemmed back to understanding what the inputs were that created output performance.
A question here, I guess, which is sort of follow on from the input output, is, so someone's saying that they run engagement surveys already in place, but how frequently would you suggest running the relationships and behaviours surveys to supplement those?
You can do it on a quarterly basis. A lot of the survey that's going out through our platform at the moment with customers is looking at the last 6-12 week periods, because we do quite a lot of emphasis on time bounding. So a quarterly basis is absolutely fine. And for sure, you don't want to get survey fatigue. But I think if you're asking individuals to complete something that's under 5 minutes, that is fundamentally about their own well-being, so that the organisation can help and support them better, I think that's a small investment.
Cool. There's one more question, but if anyone else has got any more questions, now is the time to put them in the chat or the Q&A. I'm going to ask the guys this last question, and then we're going to close off the session unless there are any more come in. So how quickly does team trust dissipate, especially with COVID-19? I think that's kind of a how long's a piece of string question.
Well, I do have one story which I mentioned in our last webinar on this, and then I'll hand over to Will. One of the most interesting periods in time in English rugby was when Eddie Jones came in and replaced Stuart Lancaster in, I think it was about mid-2015. And the England team had a pretty disappointing World Cup in 2015, had bombed in the group stages. I think they were the first home country hosting the World Cup to go out in the group stages. I think that's right. Some stato will probably correct me on that, but it was disappointing and the media hammered them. Eddie Jones came in and I think about 60% of that team was retained, and they went on a fantastic winning run. I think it was about 18 games, equaling the world record for the number of wins. So at this point, any casual observer would say that's probably a high trust, high performing team. You don't get 18 wins on the bounce. I think that's 2 years worth of winning without having a good team cohesion occurring there. And on the 19th game, they lost. I think it was in Ireland. And the fallout from that was incredible. The sort of communication afterwards, the shouting, screaming, blaming that occurred amongst the players was totally reminiscent of 2015. And what subsequently became apparent was that the last time this team or group had dealt with disappointment was in 2015, and they just reverted back to all those old patterns of communication, forgetting everything in the 2 years worth of winning. And that trust element, back to the point that this is multifaceted, that on-field performance trust didn't manifest itself in communication trust, because they'd not experienced disappointment together for a long time. So it can drop off with a significant event like COVID quite quickly.
I think it's funny with trust. It's almost like the adage you get told about respect. It takes a long time to gain respect, but you can lose it in an instant. And I think it's the same with trust. It takes a while to build up genuine trust with someone. But all it takes is for one bad decision or one bad action, and that trust can be dented significantly. And I think if we go back to one of the early slides and we talk about the challenges to trust, I think with COVID and people working remotely and not having those social interactions, I think the fastest reason why people lose it during this pandemic is because of the emotional disconnection they now have from people. Obviously Zoom is brilliant and it's awesome to do all these things, but you can't replace the kind of physical interaction you have with someone. And I think that's probably one of the big reasons why, one of the contributing reasons as to why trust kind of dissipates or had dissipated during kind of the COVID pandemic.
Thanks, guys. No more questions have come in. So I'm just going to say again, if you want to increase the visibility of your team and understand more about the trust score in your team and the impact that that is having on your performance, your profit and loss, your goal achievement, drop me an email, wendy@mypeoplegroup.com. And you can also join us in 3 weeks' time, 2nd of July, 2 o'clock, same time on a Thursday, where we will be covering trust and team goal alignment, the final piece of the jigsaw, or the Venn diagram, as the case is. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. If you do have any questions or anything like that after the webinar, then feel free to drop me an email and I will get them answered by the guys. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you on the 2nd of July.
Thank you very much, guys.
Cool.
Good to see you.